So this trip to PDAC was very last minute for me. I came in place of John Sykes. We're both at the CET. So yeah, I'm Dave Stevenson. I'm just finishing up my PhD at the CET. My specialty is more integrated geology and geophysics, whereas John Sykes works more in mineral economics, something I really don't know much about. But we did a workshop in mid-2016, and what we came up with was we were looking at what are the major things that are going to impact the future of the mining industry, and we figured one of the big issues is going to be this transition from a fossil fuel dominated economy to renewables and whatnot, and what the mining industry is going to need to do to go through that transition. So today I actually only opened up the email saying what today was going to be, didn't realize I was going to be speaking this morning. So, and John just sent me his presentation also this morning. So I'll go through a few of my slides from my work, then I'll touch on his stuff. It'll be fairly brief. So these are slides I grabbed from a recent presentation I gave at the CCFS meeting in Sydney. That's the Center for Quarter Crust Fluid Systems, if anyone doesn't know what that is. And my talk was identifying crustal architecture from potential field data, sort of the motivations behind the project, my personal motivations for doing the PhD, my methods, and then the example. I'm going to skip the methods and example for the most part. So the project motivation was that, by and large, all of our, well, this is a map of Australia with the Osmond database over top, and then this is the 1 to a million Geoscience Australia geology map. And if we look, we see sort of a 1-to-1 correlation to outcropping geology and where we have resources. We've got all these basins, and everyone's seen the Mount Isa example where we've got all these mines, and then the same architecture goes undercover, and we've got no discoveries. So the idea for me was to sort of determine the determine the relationship between crustal architecture and gold mineralization in the granites Tanami origin. So we have a bit of outcrop, but we've got a lot of decent geophysical data sets that are all open source government data sets that I think are largely underutilized. So my whole project is, we didn't collect new data except a bit of outcrop mapping. We used open source data, which is free, underutilized, reprocessed the data, reinterpreted it, remodeled it, looked at the relationship to crustal architecture where it's outcropping, and then extrapolated the structures undercover, came up with new targets, which, yeah, well, they haven't even been pegged yet. So that was the sort of project motivation. The idea was that we were combining our stratigraphic correlations, so that's my supervisor Leon Bagus's work, and then using looking at crustal architecture derived from potential field data, so just magnetics, gravity, and then a bit of radiometrics and whatnot for mapping. And then my colleague, she was doing all of the geochron and looking at the age and source of granites. So between stratigraphic correlations, architecture, age and source of granites, we could understand basin evolution, look at fluid rock interactions, determine fluid pathways for gold mineralization, and then try to pick new targets. My personal motivation was that I have an industry background. I've got about 7 years sort of field geology experience. I worked in Canada for a number of years, and there was largely mapping. I worked with the BCGS, and then I also worked up in Hope Bay, if any of you know that sort of that area. We used to, with Miramar, we had a large magnetics map sitting on the wall. I had no idea what it meant. I used to stare at it every day going, what does that mean? Then I moved to Australia. I started working with Rick Valenta, if anyone's familiar with Rick's work, and then he sort of introduced me to potential field interpretation and how we could actually map the rocks undercover using geophysical data, and that blew my mind. So then I returned to Canada, started working with juniors again. I would get all this data they had sitting on their computers. I would reprocess it, interpret it, and they go, well, what do you know? You're a geologist. We're going to pay a geophysicist to do it. They would come up with totally different interpretations than me without seeing the rocks. So I contacted, Rick again, and I said, Rick, where would you go to do a PhD in this sort of thing? I really want to integrate the geology and the geophysics. He said, he introduced me to Cam McQuaig. Cam said, I've got the perfect project for you. So that was my personal motivation, was to be this boundary spanner between geology and geophysics. Once I came to academia, then I realized that there was a huge disconnect between industry and academia, whereas in industry we were just focused on commodity prices and exploration budgets, whereas in academia it was publish or perish. And there doesn't seem to be much connection in between. When I was first started with industry, I don't ever remember reading a journal. Well, not many, you know, I didn't read many journal articles, I didn't have access to them. And now that I've worked in academia, I find a lot of my colleagues that don't have any industry experience, all they know is, you know, we need more data, we need higher tech solutions. Nobody's looking at all the open source data that's just sitting there, and vice versa. So I want to be a boundary spanner between here and then, you know, link the geology and geophysics with industry and academia. So that's my project and that's what I do. And it seems somewhat applicable to everything we've discussed this morning. If I move on to John's work, completely different, and I don't know a lot about it. I was just part of the original thinking behind it, and he's written papers on it that haven't been published yet. So the whole thing was, how will mining and exploration affect the energy transition? So we're looking at, you know, we're looking in further away places. Someone mentioned, you know, exploring the high Arctic. If we're moving to a fossil fuels free future, how are we going to actually exploit those? You know, we're looking at larger distances for transportation, for hauling and whatnot. And if we're, you know, fossil fuels are getting more expensive, and that's going to really affect mining. So yeah, the world is entering an energy transition. So we're looking at renewables and batteries. So renewables have impacts because we're going to be looking for different metals for developing wind turbines and whatnot, but then we're also going to be interested in the base load because we got increased energy demand, and we've got a larger increased environmental focus, and then also increased transportation, and that's where batteries become really important. So we're also going to need to start transitioning to explore for battery metals. And so, you know, it was a 3-day workshop, and we just sat there and worked through what was important and how we saw things and what's going to be important for companies. So we sort of have this old world scenario, which is now, you know, we're running on fossil fuels, everything is fine, but at some point we're going to encounter a transition. We don't know when it's going to be, we don't know what it's going to look like, but it's going to happen. And when we get to the transition, we sort of came up with 2 different scenarios. One was this sort of wonderland, and that was, you know, everything's moving in the tech direction and everything is going to be renewables, and I can't really go into details because I need to read his notes. And then the other side was this battlefield Earth where, you know, things just start going downhill. We still try to rely on fossil fuels, but we can't afford it. It's not sustainable. But the important thing for us in the industry is that we need to be ready. We need to be successful here. We need to be ready for the transition. So to be able to go through the transition without losing our jobs, and then also we don't want to be left behind through the transition, so we need to be ready to adapt. So here's this one again, which pill do you choose? So we need to know when to go through this transition. We don't want to jump the gun because, you know, we may get left behind now, and then but which future are we going to encounter? So first we need to survive this old world. Then we need to thrive in the future, whether it's going to be sort of driven by innovation, sustainability, and just globalization, or are we going to, or is the future going to be a little bit more of a negative? So that's the end of it. So the question is, what does all this mean for the mining companies and their investors? I encourage you to come to the talk because I'll be better prepared, I promise.
All right, nice to hear. Good.